The clock on the wall of Ridgeline shooting range ticked past noon as the glass door swung open, bringing in a gust of autumn air. Margaret Chen stepped inside, her small frame bundled in a faded blue cardigan despite the warmth of the day. At 78, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that rushing led to mistakes. The canvas bag slung over her shoulder looked worn but well cared for, much like its owner. The modern shooting facility hummed with weekend activity. Pop music played faintly beneath the muffled sounds of gunfire from the range beyond the soundproof doors. The air smelled of gun oil, coffee, and the artificial pine of cleaning products. Glass display cases lined the walls, showcasing gleaming firearms and accessories under bright lights. Margaret paused just inside, blinking behind her large glasses as her eyes adjusted from the bright sunshine outside. She took in the scene with a quiet gaze that missed nothing. A group of young men in tactical pants and fitted shirts comparing their equipment near the counter. A father teaching his teenage daughter how to fill out the safety forms. Two middle-aged women in matching shooting vests chatting with the cashier. No one immediately noticed Margaret. This wasn't unusual. She had grown accustomed to becoming somewhat invisible with age. She adjusted her bag and made her way to the counter, waiting patiently while a young man with a sleeve of tattoos finished ringing up a box of ammunition for another customer. "Can I help you?" he asked when he finally turned to her, his voice carrying the slight impatience of someone ready for their lunch break. "I'd like a lane, please," Margaret said, her voice soft but clear. For 2 hours. The young man, his name tag read Tyler, paused, his fingers hovering over the computer keyboard. His eyes did a quick assessment of the elderly woman before him. "The quilting club meets next door at the community center," he said, not unkindly. "This is Ridgeline shooting range." A small smile touched the corners of Margaret's mouth. "Yes, I know." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a membership card, the plastic worn at the edges, and slid it across the counter. Tyler's eyebrows rose slightly as he picked up the card. It was an old-style membership, not the new digital ones they'd switched to last year. He tapped at his computer, looking increasingly confused. "This membership is still active," he said, sounding surprised. "It says you've been a member since 1986. Margaret nodded. "That's right." Behind her, one of the tactical-dressed men snorted quietly. Margaret pretended not to hear. Tyler handed back her card. "Lane 7 is open. Do you need to rent any equipment?" "No, thank you," Margaret replied, patting her canvas bag. "I brought my own." As she turned away from the counter, she caught the exchange of glances between Tyler and the waiting customers, the raised eyebrows, the barely concealed smirks. She'd seen those looks before. They didn't bother her anymore, not really. Lane 7 was at the far end of the range, away from the cluster of shooters near the center. Margaret appreciated the relative quiet as she set her bag on the small table and began to unpack. Ear protection, safety glasses, a cleaning cloth, and finally, a simple leather case. Her movements were methodical, each item placed precisely where she wanted it. 3 lanes down, the group of men who had been at the counter were settling in, their conversation punctuated by laughter and the metallic sounds of expensive equipment being unpacked, their voices carried despite their efforts to keep them low. "Think Grandma got lost on her way to the grocery store? Maybe she's buying protection for her retirement home. $10 says she doesn't know which end of the gun to hold." Margaret continued her preparations as if she hadn't heard them. She opened the leather case and removed a Remington 700 rifle that had seen better days. The stock was worn smooth from years of handling, but the metal gleamed with the dull shine that came from decades of careful maintenance. She was adjusting her ear protection when footsteps approached from behind. She turned to see one of the men from the laughing group, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and a cap turned backward on his head. "Need some help with that, ma'am?" he asked, gesturing to her ear protection. His tone was friendly enough, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he glanced back at his friends who were watching with amused expressions. "No, thank you," Margaret replied. "I've got it." "That's quite a vintage piece you've got there," he said, nodding toward her rifle. "Family heirloom?" "Something like that," Margaret said. "Name's Roger," he said. "My buddies and I come here every weekend. If you need any pointers, just wave us down." Again, that smile that wasn't really a smile. "I appreciate the offer," Margaret said simply. Roger seemed disappointed by her calm response. He lingered a moment longer, perhaps hoping for something that would give his friends a better story. Before returning to his lane, Margaret finished setting up, her hands moving with the muscle memory that came from thousands of repetitions. She loaded her rifle with deliberate care, her thin fingers steady despite the fine lines and age spots that covered them. The range was busy now, the sound of gunfire regular despite the sound dampening. Through her ear protection, it all became a muffled background noise like distant thunder on a summer afternoon. Margaret took her position, settling the worn stock against her shoulder with the familiarity of greeting an old friend. She drew in a deep breath, held it, and then released it slowly. The world narrowed to just her and the target. The chatter, the judging glances, the assumptions, all of it fell away. At the moment she squeezed the trigger, a figure appeared at the corner of her vision. Tall, gray-haired, with the straight posture that suggested military background. The rangemaster. Margaret completed her shot, a clean hit to the center of the target, before turning to acknowledge him. "Afternoon," he said, loud enough to be heard through the ear protection. His name badge read Hector Rodriguez, Rangemaster. "Haven't seen you here in a while." "Been busy," Margaret replied with a small shrug. "Family matters." Hector nodded, his eyes straying to her rifle and then to the target downrange where her single shot had left a hole dead center. "Still got it, I see." "Some things you don't forget," she said. His eyes lingered on her face a moment longer, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossing his features. But he just nodded again and moved on to the next lane. Margaret returned to her shooting, aware now that Hector was watching her between his routine checks of the other shooters. She didn't mind. There was something comforting about being seen, truly seen, after so long. By her fifth shot, she had settled into a rhythm. Breathe in, hold, breathe out halfway, squeeze. The rifle bucked gently against her shoulder with each shot, a familiar sensation that brought with it a flood of memories. Desert heat, mountain cold, the weight of responsibility. She was replacing her target when she noticed Hector in quiet conversation with another older man who had entered the range, this one with the stooped shoulders and thick glasses of someone who spent most of his life behind a desk. The man kept glancing in Margaret's direction, his expression growing increasingly animated as Hector spoke. Margaret pretended not to notice, but she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Recognition always brought complications, questions, sometimes gratitude, sometimes resentment, always attention she'd rather avoid. She focused on her new target, adjusting her stance slightly. In the lane beside her, a young couple had begun setting up, the woman clearly new to shooting, her partner patiently explaining the basics. Margaret listened with half an ear, silently approving of his emphasis on safety. Down the range, Roger and his friends had grown louder, showing off with rapid-fire sequences that showed more enthusiasm than skill. Their targets told the story, scattered hits with little consistency. All that expensive gear, Margaret thought, and no fundamentals. She completed another series of shots, each one finding its mark with quiet precision. No wasted movement, no showing off. Just the clean efficiency that had once been the difference between life and death. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret became aware of more glances in her direction, not just from Hector and the older man, but from others who had noticed her targets. The consistent grouping of shots in the center circle was drawing attention she hadn't sought. She began to pack up before her 2 hours were complete. Better to leave now before the whispers grew louder, before someone remembered where they'd seen her face before, or heard her name in old stories. "Leaving so soon?" Hector asked, appearing beside her lane as she closed her rifle case. "Got what I needed," Margaret replied. "Just keeping the rust off." Hector smiled, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling. "You know we've got a friendly competition coming up next weekend. Nothing serious, just bragging rights and maybe a gift card to the coffee shop. You should come." Margaret hesitated, her hands pausing in their task. "I don't compete anymore." "Not asking you to compete," Hector said. "Just suggesting you might enjoy the company of folks who'd appreciate your skill." He glanced meaningfully toward Roger's group, who were now posing for photos with their guns in ways that made Margaret wince internally. "I'll think about it," she said, knowing she probably wouldn't. Hector seemed to understand. He nodded and stepped back, allowing her to finish packing up in peace. As Margaret zipped her bag closed, She caught the eye of the young woman at the next lane. The woman smiled hesitantly. "That was amazing," she said. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that, especially with such a simple setup." Margaret felt a warmth she hadn't expected. "It's not the equipment that makes the shot," she said. "It's the fundamentals: breathing, focus, patience. Could you maybe show me?" the young woman asked. "Just a couple of tips. I'm all over the place." She gestured at her target with its widely scattered holes. Margaret glanced at her watch. Her empty apartment wasn't going anywhere, and there was something in the young woman's earnest request that tugged at her. "All right," she said, setting her bag back down. "Let's look at your stance." As she helped the young woman adjust her position, Margaret didn't notice Roger watching from his lane, his expression now more curious than mocking. Nor did she see Hector smiling as he spoke into his radio, telling someone on the other end, "Yes, it's definitely her. Chen, the one from the old Delta section records. No, I'm not kidding. She's here right now, teaching some newcomer the basics like it's nothing." Margaret was focused on the moment, on passing along a small piece of the knowledge that had defined her life. For the first time in a long while, she felt properly visible, and it felt good. The young woman, Lily, beamed at her target. After just 20 minutes of Margaret's guidance, her shots had tightened into a respectable grouping. Not perfect, but a vast improvement from the scattered pattern of before. "That's incredible," Lily said, lowering her pistol with proper muzzle discipline. Something else Margaret had quietly corrected. "It's like you unlocked a secret level in my brain or something." Margaret smiled, a genuine expression that softened the weathered lines of her face. "Not a secret. Just fundamentals that people tend to forget when they get caught up in all the fancy gear." She nodded toward Roger's group, where the men were now taking turns with what appeared to be a custom AR-15, with enough attachments to make it look like something from a science fiction movie. "Speaking of fancy gear," Lily's boyfriend, David, said as he rejoined them carrying bottled waters, "Those guys have been eyeing you since you started helping Lily. I think they're jealous." Margaret accepted the water with a nod of thanks. Nothing to be jealous of. Just an old woman sharing basic tips. "Basic tips that work better than their expensive lessons," Lily said, taking a swig of water. "Roger over there has been bragging all afternoon about the private instructor he hired. Former Navy SEAL or something, is that so?" Margaret said, her tone neutral. David leaned in, lowering his voice. "He's been telling everyone he's preparing for some elite shooting competition next month. Acts like he's going to sweep all the awards." Margaret capped her water bottle and placed it neatly beside her bag. "Well, I should be going. You're doing fine now, Lily. Remember what I showed you about breathing." "You're not staying to finish your time?" Lily asked, disappointment clear in her voice. "I've done enough for today," Margaret replied. She had nearly finished packing when Roger's booming voice carried down the range. "Hey, Granny Annie Oakley. Giving lessons now?" Margaret didn't react immediately, continuing to zip her bag with the same careful movements. Only when Roger approached her lane with two of his friends did she look up. "My friend here thinks you must have been some kind of shooting instructor," Roger said, gesturing to a shorter man with a goatee. "But I told him you probably just got lucky with a few shots." "Everyone gets lucky sometimes," Margaret replied mildly. The man with the goatee, his range badge read Paul, looked at her with narrowed eyes. "Those weren't lucky shots. That was skill." "Military?" Margaret shrugged. "I've done some shooting over the years." Roger laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Come on, look at her. What, you think she was some kind of sniper, Granny?" "I didn't say that," Paul muttered, but Roger was already warming to his joke. "Let me guess," Roger continued, leaning against the dividing wall of the lane. "You learned to shoot to keep the raccoons out of your garden? Or was it for those pesky neighborhood kids who won't stay off your lawn?" His other friend snickered, but Paul looked uncomfortable. "Roger, man, ease up." "What? I'm just having some fun," Roger said. "Hey, I know, why don't you join us? We're having a little competition. $20 buy-in. Winner takes all." "Show us what you've got, Granny." Margaret lifted her bag. "No, thank you. I don't compete anymore." "Anymore?" Roger echoed, his eyebrows rising. "So you did compete? What, in the senior center turkey shoot?" His friends laughed this time, even Paul, though his laugh seemed forced. Margaret moved to walk past them, but Roger stepped sideways, not quite blocking her path, but making it clear he wasn't done. "Come on, one round. Unless you're afraid we'll show you up." He patted his holster where an expensive competition pistol was visible. I've got top-of-the-line equipment here. Custom grip, match-grade barrel, fiber optic sights. Cost more than your monthly Social Security check, I'd bet. I'm sure it's very nice, Margaret said, her voice still calm. Roger? Lily cut in, stepping forward. Leave her alone. She was just helping me. Roger gave Lily a dismissive glance. Stay out of this, newbie. The adults are talking. David bristled beside Lily, but Margaret shook her head slightly at him. She'd seen enough young men get into pointless confrontations. No need for another. Tell you what, Roger said, turning back to Margaret. I'll make it easier for you. No buy-in, just for fun. 1 round, 5 shots, highest score wins bragging rights. What do you say? Or are your hands too shaky these days? There was a moment of silence in which Margaret seemed to be considering something far beyond the simple challenge. Her eyes, sharp behind her glasses, studied Roger's face as if reading something written there that no one else could see. All right, she said finally. 1 round. Roger looked surprised, then pleased. Well, all right. Granny's got some spirit after all. Paul, go set up fresh targets. As Paul moved to comply, Margaret set her bag down again and unzipped it, retrieving her pistol case this time instead of the rifle she'd been using earlier. Oh, bringing out the pea shooter, huh? Roger said, watching as she opened the case to reveal a plain-looking pistol that had clearly seen years of use. What's that, a .22? 9mm, Margaret corrected quietly. Standard issue. Standard issue for what, mall security? Roger laughed at his own joke, but Paul was looking at the weapon with new interest. That looks like a Beretta M9, he said. Military issue. Similar, Margaret acknowledged, checking the pistol with practiced movements. By now, their exchange had drawn attention. Several other shooters had paused their own practice to watch. Hector, the rangemaster, had drifted closer as well, a knowing look on his face. Ladies first, Roger said with an exaggerated bow when the targets were ready. Margaret took her position without comment. She adjusted her stance, gripped the pistol with both hands, and took a deep breath. The range fell oddly quiet as she aimed. 5 shots rang out in steady succession, not rushed but with a rhythm that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Margaret lowered the pistol and engaged the safety before setting it down. Not bad for arthritis, huh? Roger said, but his joke fell flat as the target was brought forward. All 5 shots had hit within the innermost ring, grouped so tightly they almost looked like a single hole. A low whistle came from somewhere behind them. Beginner's luck, Roger said, but his confident smile had faltered. My turn. He stepped up with a flourish, adjusting his cap and rolling his shoulders. His pistol gleamed under the range lights, its custom grips and modified trigger catching the eye. Roger took his stance, a textbook competition stance that looked well practiced, and fired his 5 shots in quick succession. When his target came forward, the results were good, all within the scoring rings, grouped respectably, but nowhere near Margaret's tight cluster. Roger stared at the 2 targets side by side, his expression caught between disbelief and annoyance. I wasn't warmed up, he said finally. Best 2 out of 3. We said 1 round. Margaret reminded him, already packing up her pistol. Come on, that's not fair. I wasn't ready. Looks like the lady won fair and square, called out an older man from a few lanes down, the same one Margaret had seen talking with Hector earlier. Roger turned, ready to argue, but stopped short when he saw who had spoken. The man's jacket, partially unzipped, revealed a shirt with a military logo. And who asked you? Roger said, but with noticeably less confidence. Nobody. The man replied easily. Just stating facts. The lady outshot you. Simple as that. More spectators had gathered now, drawn by the unusual competition. Margaret continued packing, seemingly unmoved by the attention, though a slight tightness around her mouth suggested she was not entirely comfortable with it. You said you used to compete, Paul said to Margaret, curiosity overcoming his earlier awkwardness. What kind of competitions? Before Margaret could answer, Hector stepped in. Ms. Chen here has some history in the shooting world, he said. Isn't that right, Margaret? Margaret gave him a look that might have been warning or resignation. Ancient history, she said. Not that ancient, the older man called out. Records still stand, don't they? A murmur went through the small crowd. Roger looked between Margaret and the older man, confusion replacing his earlier smugness. Records? What records? Margaret zipped her bag closed with finality. Nothing important? Nothing important? The older man laughed. Only 3 marksmanship records at Quantico that nobody's been able to touch in 30 years. Nothing important, she says. The murmuring grew louder. Roger's expression shifted again, this time to something approaching awe mixed with embarrassment. Quantico? He repeated. As in, FBI Quantico? Among other things, the older man said with a meaningful nod. Margaret slung her bag over her shoulder. If you'll excuse me, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. I need to be going. Wait, Roger said, stepping toward her. The mocking tone was gone from his voice. I'm sorry about, what I said earlier. I didn't realize. It's fine, Margaret cut him off. No harm done. But I'd like to, Roger began. But Margaret was already walking away, her small figure somehow straighter, more commanding than it had seemed before. The crowd parted to let her through, several people nodding respectfully as she passed. Hector followed her to the door. You know they're all going to be talking about you now, he said quietly. Margaret sighed. That's why I don't do this anymore, Hector. I just wanted a quiet afternoon at the range. You could come back for the competition next weekend, he suggested. Might be good for some of these hotshots to learn a thing or two from someone with real experience. Margaret paused at the door, looking back at the range where Roger and his friends were now huddled in deep conversation, occasionally glancing her way. Lily caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up. Maybe, Margaret said, but they both knew it wasn't a commitment. As she stepped outside into the late afternoon sunshine, she heard the older man's voice carrying from inside. You kids don't even know who you were just mouthing off to. That woman trained half the specialist units that went into. The door swung shut, cutting off his words. Margaret walked to her car, a practical sedan as unassuming as she was. As she drove away from the range, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she hadn't seen in months. Heard you were back at Ridgeline today. Word travels fast. Bravo team having reunion dinner next Friday. You should come. No excuses this time. Margaret put the phone down without replying. The past never stayed buried, no matter how quiet you tried to keep it. She'd deal with that text later. For now, she just wanted to get home, make a cup of tea, and sit in her favorite chair by the window, where she could watch the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded her of distant places and long-ago missions. Maybe she would go back to the range next weekend after all, just to see the look on Roger's face. Margaret's apartment was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the clock her late husband had fixed countless times over their 40 years together. She sat in her worn armchair by the window, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the side table as she stared at her phone. 3 more messages had arrived since she left the range. Come on, Chen, don't leave us hanging. Everyone's asking about you. Thompson will be there. You know he never leaves his cabin these days. Making an exception for you. It's at Rivera's place, good food. No speeches, promise. She set the phone down without replying and picked up her tea. The familiar routine of her evening stretched before her. Dinner for 1, the news at 7. Perhaps a chapter of the mystery novel on her nightstand before sleep. Safe. Predictable. Anonymous. The day at the range had stirred something she'd spent years carefully putting to rest. Not regret. She'd never regretted her service, but the weight of memory, the complexity of a life lived in shadows. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Hector from the range. Words getting around about today. You've got some fans here now, including that Roger fellow, believe it or not. He's been asking questions. Margaret sighed. Of course he had. She typed a brief reply. Nothing to tell. Just an old woman who can still shoot straight. Hector's response came quickly. Both know that's not true. Competition next Saturday. Think about it. 10 a.m. Margaret set the phone aside again and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting pools of yellow light on the sidewalk where an elderly couple walked hand in hand, their pace unhurried. Time was. She could have told them exactly how far they were standing, calculated the wind drift on a shot from this distance, factored in the temperature and humidity. Old habits died hard, her tea had gone cold. As she rose to reheat it, a knock sounded at her door. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone. She rarely had visitors these days, aside from her daughter who lived across town and visited on Sundays. Through the peephole, she saw the older man from the range, the one who had called out Roger and mentioned her records. gray-haired with the straight posture that screamed military even in civilian clothes. She hesitated, then opened the door. "William Chen," the man said with a smile. "Been a long time." "Harold," Margaret replied, recognizing him now in the better light. "How did you find my address?" asked Hector. "Hope you don't mind. Can I come in for a minute?" Margaret stepped aside to let him enter. Harold Wilson had been part of her unit years ago, a communications specialist with a knack for languages. "Nice place," he said, glancing around the modest apartment. His eyes lingered on a small shelf where a few photographs sat in simple frames. Margaret in uniform, decades younger. Margaret with her late husband. Margaret with a young woman who had her eyes. "What brings you here, Harold?" Margaret asked, steering him toward the small dining table rather than the more intimate living room. "Straight to the point. You haven't changed." Harold settled into a chair with a slight grimace that spoke of old injuries. "I was surprised to see you at the range today. Word was you'd hung up your shooting glasses for good." "I go occasionally, just to keep the rust off," Harold nodded. "Those kids had no idea who they were messing with." "And I'd prefer to keep it that way," Margaret said pointedly. "That's going to be hard now." "You made quite an impression." Harold leaned forward. "Look, I didn't just come to reminisce. There's something happening. A reunion, yes, but also a request." Margaret shook her head. "I'm retired, Harold. For real this time. Whatever it is, I'm not interested. Just hear me out. The agency is putting together a training program. Very hush-hush. They want to bring in some of the old guard as consultants. Your name came up." "My name is always coming up," Margaret said. "The answer is still no. It's just training, Maggie. Passing on what you know. These new recruits, they're all technology and no instinct. They can hit targets on a range but put them in the field." He shook his head. "I'm 78 years old, Harold, and still shooting better than men a third your age. I saw that grouping today." His voice softened. "No one's asking you to go back in the field. Just talk to them. Show them a few things." Margaret rose and went to the kitchen, more to give herself a moment than because she needed anything. Harold waited, patient as always. He'd been like that in the field, too. Could sit in a hide for days without fidgeting. "Why now?" she asked finally, returning with her reheated tea and a coffee for him. "It's been years. Things are heating up in certain regions. The old playbook isn't working anymore. They need people who understand the human element." Harold took the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Besides, I think you're getting bored." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Come on, Chen." The Margaret I knew wouldn't be sitting in an apartment waiting for her weekly visit from her daughter. "You were always restless between assignments. People change, Harold. They grow older. Find peace with quiet lives." Harold studied her over his coffee cup. "Have you? Found peace?" The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been for such simple words. "I've found routine," Margaret answered finally. "It's not the same thing, but it serves its purpose." "That's what I thought." Harold set down his cup. "The competition at the range next Saturday. It's not just a local thing. There will be some people there. People who are interested in the program. No pressure, just a chance to see what it's about." "You set this up," Margaret said, realization dawning. "You knew I still went to Ridgeline occasionally." Harold shrugged. "I keep tabs on old friends. Sue me." Margaret shook her head, but there was the ghost of a smile on her lips.
"Still running ops, Harold?"
"Some things never change." "Speaking of change," Harold said, reaching into his pocket, "I brought something for you." He placed a faded photograph on the table between them. Margaret didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. Delta Section, 1983. 12 men and women in desert camo standing in front of a helicopter. She was in the center, younger. Hair black instead of silver, but with the same steady gaze. "Where did you find this?" she asked softly. "Thompson had it. We got together last month, just a few of us. Talked about old times. Your name came up like it always does." Harold tapped the photo. "You were the best of us, Maggie. The very best." Margaret touched the edge of the photograph, memories flooding back. The heat, the dust, the weight of responsibility. The bond that formed only under fire. "They're all coming on Saturday," Harold said. "Everyone who's still around. Thompson, Rivera, Patel, Jackson. Even Cooper's flying in from Alaska." "Cooper?" Margaret looked up in surprise. Last I heard he was living off the grid, swearing he'd never set foot in civilization again. "For you, he's making an exception." Harold smiled. "We all are." Margaret was silent for a long moment. her finger tracing the outline of faces in the photograph, some now gone, others grown old alongside her. "Just to watch," she said finally. "No promises about any program. That's all I'm asking." Harold's smile widened. "For now." After Harold left, Margaret remained at the table, the old photograph before her. She should call her daughter, let her know about the competition in case she wanted to come. Anne had never seen her mother shoot. Margaret had kept that part of her life carefully separated from her family. Her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "Thompson says he's bringing that bottle of scotch from 89. Says you'll know what that means." Margaret did know. They'd saved that bottle, carried it through 3 countries during one particularly difficult operation, vowing to open it when everyone made it home, against the odds they had. She picked up the phone and for the first time replied, "Tell him to bring glasses. I'll be there." The next morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. Instead of her normal routine, she found herself opening the closet in the spare bedroom, pushing aside rarely worn clothes to reveal a locked case tucked in the back corner. The combination came to her fingers without thought. Anne's birthday, her husband's birth year, the number of confirmed targets from her final mission. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a rifle unlike the one she'd taken to the range, custom-built, precision-engineered, with a worn wooden stock that had been molded to her grip through thousands of hours of use. Not standard issue. This had been made for her specifically, a gift from her unit when she had broken her 3rd and final record. Margaret ran her hands over it, checking it with practiced movements. Muscle memory didn't fade, not really. It just waited, patient as an old friend. She had told herself she was done with this life, that the competitions, the recognition, the responsibility, it was all behind her. But as she held the familiar weight in her hands, something long dormant stirred inside her chest. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter but no less powerful. Purpose. Her phone rang, Anne checking in as she did most mornings. "Morning, Mom. Sleep well?" "Fine, dear." Margaret hesitated, then said, "I'm going to be in a shooting competition on Saturday, at Ridgeline Range. Would you like to come watch?" The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "A shooting competition?" Anne repeated. "You mean like, with guns?" Margaret almost laughed. "Yes, Anne, with guns. I didn't know you." Anne trailed off. "I mean, I knew Dad taught you basics for home protection, but a competition?" It struck Margaret then how little her daughter knew about her life before. How carefully she had compartmentalized, becoming just Mom, just Margaret Chen, the middle school teacher's widow, hiding the woman who had once been whispered about in briefing rooms and feared by enemies she never met face to face. "There's a lot you don't know," Margaret said gently. "Maybe it's time I told you some of it. Mom, you're being mysterious." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "Better than fine?" Margaret looked down at the rifle in her lap, at her hands that despite their age spots and wrinkles were still steady, still capable, just thinking it might be time for some changes. When she hung up, promising to explain everything over dinner that night, Margaret returned to the rifle. It would need cleaning, checking, adjusting for Saturday. And she would need practice, not just shooting, but being seen. Being known for who she was, not just who she appeared to be. She thought of Roger and his friends, of their mockery turned to awe, of Lily's admiration and Harold's confidence in her skills even after all these years. The phone buzzed again with a message from Hector. That Roger kid signed up for the competition. "Says he hopes you'll be there. I think he wants a rematch." Margaret smiled to herself. Let him try. Some lessons were best taught through experience. She wrapped the rifle carefully and placed it in its carrying case. The range would be quiet this early on a weekday. Time enough to reacquaint herself with an old friend, to prepare not just for Saturday's competition, but for whatever came after. For the first time in years, Margaret Chen was looking forward to tomorrow. Anne sat across from her mother at the small dining table, her dinner barely touched. The story Margaret had just shared seemed impossible to reconcile with the quiet, practical woman who had packed her school lunches and attended every parent-teacher conference. "Special Forces?" Anne repeated. "You were in Special Forces?" "Not exactly," Margaret said. "I was a specialist attached to various units. My official title changed over the years." "And Dad knew about all this?" Margaret nodded. "We met through the service. He was intelligence analysis. I was field operations. Anne pushed her plate away. I don't understand why you never told me. All these years I thought you were just a school secretary before you married Dad. That was my cover job, Margaret explained gently. And after a while, when I left active service, it became real enough. Then you came along and that life seemed very far away. But you kept shooting. Yes, less and less over time, but yes, it is part of who I am. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. I'm sorry I kept this from you. I thought I was protecting you. From what? Anne asked. From knowing your mother was some kind of hero? Margaret shook her head. I was never a hero, Anne. Just someone doing a job that needed doing. And in those days, it was better for families not to know too much. Safer. Anne was silent for a long moment, processing. So this competition on Saturday? Some old colleagues will be there. People I served with. And there's a possibility of a consulting position. Nothing dangerous, she added quickly, seeing Anne's expression. Just training. Passing on skills to a new generation. At 78, age is just a number in some fields, Margaret said with a small smile. Experience counts for a lot. Anne studied her mother's face. You seem different, more alive somehow, do I? Margaret hadn't noticed it herself. But she had slept better last night than she had in months, woken with a sense of purpose that had been missing for too long. Will you show me? Anne asked suddenly. How you shoot, I mean. I've never seen it. Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. Pride, perhaps, or simply relief at finally sharing this part of herself with her daughter. I'd like that, she said softly. Very much. The next day, Margaret arrived at Ridgeline Range at precisely 9 in the morning. The place was nearly empty on a weekday, just as she'd hoped. Hector was at the counter, eyebrows rising in surprise when he saw her. Twice in 1 week, he remarked. To what do we owe the honor? Need to knock off some rust before Saturday, Margaret replied, signing in. My daughter's coming to watch. About time, Hector said with a knowing nod. Lane 3's open. I'll keep the yahoos away if any show up. Margaret set up her lane methodically, taking her time. The rifle she'd brought today was different from both weapons she'd used earlier in the week. A bolt-action precision rifle with a scope that cost more than some used cars. She handled it with the ease of long familiarity, each movement economical and practiced. She was halfway through her first set when she became aware of someone watching. Glancing to her side, she saw Roger standing several lanes down, his expression a mix of curiosity and something that might have been respect. Margaret nodded to him and returned to her shooting. Let him watch if he wanted to. She had nothing to hide anymore. After she finished her round, Roger approached cautiously, staying behind the firing line. Miss Chen, he said, his voice missing the cocky edge from their previous encounter. I wanted to apologize properly. For the other day. I was out of line. Margaret lowered her rifle. Apology accepted. Roger shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I didn't know. I looked you up after. Online. There's not much, but there's enough to know that you're, well, kind of a legend. Hardly that, Margaret said. 3 unbroken records at Quantico. Instructor for, he lowered his voice, special operations units. That Delta section they mentioned. Ancient history. Not to shooters, it isn't. Roger hesitated, then plunged ahead. I signed up for the competition on Saturday. I know I don't stand a chance against you, but I was hoping. Maybe you could give me a few pointers? Like you did for that woman the other day. Margaret studied him, seeing past the expensive gear and bravado to something more genuine. A young man who truly loved shooting, who wanted to improve, who had perhaps been trying too hard to impress. Fundamentals, she said finally. That's where most people go wrong. All the fancy equipment in the world won't help if your breathing is off or your stance is wrong. Would you, Roger swallowed. Would you watch me shoot around? Tell me what I'm doing wrong? Margaret checked her watch. She had planned 2 hours of practice and she'd barely started. But there was something in Roger's humbled request that appealed to the instructor in her. The part that had always taken satisfaction in passing on knowledge. 1 round, she agreed. Then I need to get back to my own practice. The gratitude on Roger's face made him look younger, more like the eager student he might have been if they'd met differently. For the next half hour, Margaret observed Roger's shooting, making small corrections to his breathing, His trigger discipline, the way he positioned his elbow. By the end, his grouping had tightened noticeably. "That's amazing," Roger said, staring at his target. Just those tiny adjustments made that much difference. "It's the little things that separate good from great," Margaret told him. "Now, if you'll excuse me." "Of course." "Thank you, Miss Chen, really." Roger stepped back, giving her space. "I'll see you Saturday?" Margaret nodded. "I'll be here." As she returned to her own lane, she felt a curious lightness. Teaching had always satisfied something in her, even back in her active days when she trained new recruits. Perhaps this consulting position Harold had mentioned wasn't such a far-fetched idea after all. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret established a routine: mornings at the range, afternoons resting, evenings reviewing old manuals and techniques she hadn't thought about in years. Her body remembered more than she'd expected, muscle memory taking over once she gave it permission. By Friday evening, she felt ready, not just physically, but mentally. The compartment she'd built in her mind to separate her past from her present had cracked open, allowing the two halves of her life to merge in a way that felt surprisingly right. Anne called just as Margaret was cleaning her rifle one final time. "I'm bringing someone tomorrow," Anne said without preamble. "Is that okay?" "Of course, who?" "Tom, my boyfriend. I've mentioned him before." Margaret smiled to herself. Anne had indeed mentioned Tom multiple times over the past few months, but had been oddly reluctant to introduce him. "He's really interested in meeting you," Anne continued. "Especially after I told him about, your background." "You told him?" "Just the basics. That you were some kind of special government agent. He thinks it's the coolest thing ever." Margaret chuckled. "Well, I look forward to meeting him." After they hung up, Margaret finished her preparations, laying out her shooting gear for the morning. As she was about to turn in, a text arrived from Harold. "Everyone's in town. Meeting for breakfast at the diner across from the range. 7 a.m., be there." Margaret set her alarm for 5:30 earlier than usual, but found she didn't need it. She woke naturally at 5:15, feeling more alert than she had in years. The diner was nearly empty when she arrived, except for a table in the back where 5 people sat. 4 men and 1 woman, all in their 60s or 70s. They didn't look extraordinary, just a group of older folks having breakfast. But Margaret knew better than most how deceptive appearances could be. Thompson spotted her first, his weathered face breaking into a grin that took years off his age. "Chen, get over here!" The reunion was warmer than Margaret had expected. Genuine hugs, hands clasped tightly, the easy camaraderie of people who had trusted each other with their lives. "You haven't aged a day," Cooper declared, pulling out a chair for her. "Liar," Margaret replied, but she was smiling. "Heard you showed up some young hotshot at the range," Rivera said, passing her a coffee. Some things never change. They caught up over breakfast, sharing stories of retirement, grandchildren, hobbies. Normal things that felt extraordinary given who they had once been, what they had done. No one mentioned the consulting position until they were nearly finished eating. "So Harold told you about the program?" Patel asked finally. Margaret nodded. "Some of it. They need us, Maggie," Thompson said. "These kids today, they've got all the technology in the world, but they're missing the human element. The instinct. The patience. And you think we can teach them that?" "We can try," Rivera said. "Better than letting all that experience go to waste while we sit around waiting to die." "Always the optimist, Rivera," Cooper laughed. Jackson, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "You're the key, Chen. If you sign on, the rest of us will. If not," she shrugged. "Hard to justify the program with just us old fogies." Margaret looked around the table at the faces of her former team, older now, lined with experience and years, but still sharp, still vital. "Let me get through today first," she said. One challenge at a time, they understood. They always had. As they walked across to the range together, Margaret felt a certainty settling over her. Whatever happened in the competition today, her life had already changed. The careful wall she'd built between past and present had crumbled, and in its place was something new, a bridge perhaps, connecting who she had been with who she still could be. Roger was already at the range when they arrived, setting up his equipment with focused concentration. He looked up as Margaret entered with her former team, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of 6 older people who, despite their age, moved with the unmistakable confidence of predators. "That him?" Thompson murmured. That's him, Margaret confirmed. Nice gear, Cooper observed. Let's see if he's learned to use it. The range was filling up now, regular members, curious onlookers drawn by rumors of the competition. And at the far end, a group of men and women in civilian clothes who nonetheless stood with military bearing. The agency representatives, Margaret guessed. Anne arrived with a tall, brown-haired man who must be Tom. She waved excitedly when she spotted her mother. Margaret took a deep breath. It was time to stop hiding. Time to bring together all the pieces of who she was. Mother, widow, teacher, sniper. The competition was set to begin at 10. By 9:30, Ridgeline Range buzzed with more activity than Margaret had seen in all her visits combined. Regular members mingled with curious newcomers, many drawn by word of mouth about the senior lady sniper who had put the young hotshots in their place. Hector had organized the event with military precision, 3 separate challenges testing different shooting skills, with competitors divided into groups based on experience level. Despite numerous attempts by others to convince her to enter the expert category, Margaret had registered as an intermediate. Don't want to scare away the competition entirely, she had told Harold with a wink. Anne and Tom found her as she was, checking her equipment one last time. Mom, Anne called, weaving through the crowd. This is Tom. Tom was a pleasant-looking man in his 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. It's an honor to meet you, Ms. Chen, he said. Anne's told me. Well, recently told me. Quite a lot about you, Margaret smiled. Only the good parts, I hope. Are there bad parts? Tom asked with genuine curiosity. In every life, Margaret replied simply. Anne squeezed her mother's hand. We'll be cheering for you. Tom's never been to a shooting competition before. Neither have I, Margaret admitted. Not for many years anyway. As Anne and Tom found seats in the designated spectator area, Roger approached, his usual entourage notably absent. Ms. Chen, he greeted her with newfound respect. Just wanted to wish you good luck today. You too, Roger, Margaret replied. Remember what we practiced. Breathing, focus, fundamentals. He nodded seriously. Though I don't think it'll be enough to beat you. Competitions aren't always about winning, Margaret told him. Sometimes they're about discovering what you're capable of. Roger seemed to consider this. Well, either way, I'm glad you're here. It's an honor to compete with you. As he walked away, Thompson sidled up beside Margaret. Kids got potential. Once you strip away all that attitude, most of them do, Margaret agreed. They just need the right guidance. A microphone squealed and Hector's voice boomed across the range. Welcome everyone to Ridgeline Spring Precision Challenge. We've got a great lineup of shooters today, from beginners to experts. Margaret tuned out the announcements, focusing instead on her mental preparation, the familiar ritual of centering herself, finding that still point inside where nothing existed but the target and her breath. Age might have slowed her body, but this razor-sharp focus was as strong as ever. First round will be standard target shooting at 3 distances, Hector was saying. Second round, moving targets. Final round, precision shooting under time pressure. Highest combined score wins. The intermediate group was called first. Margaret took her position alongside 7 other shooters, including Roger. She noticed him glancing her way, perhaps seeking reassurance. She gave him a small nod. Shooters ready? Hector called. Margaret settled into her stance, rifle nestled against her shoulder like an old friend. The weight felt right, felt like coming home after a long absence. Begin. The first round passed in a blur of concentrated focus. 3 distances, 5 shots each. Margaret didn't need to check her targets to know she'd hit exactly where she aimed. The muscle memory, the instinct honed through thousands of hours of practice, it was all still there, waiting to be called upon. When the targets were brought forward for scoring, a murmur ran through the spectators. Perfect scores across all 3 distances. Roger had done well too, not perfect, but impressive. His grouping showed the improvement from their brief training session. Looking good, Chen, Cooper said as she stepped away from the line, just like old times. The second round presented more of a challenge. Clay pigeons launched at random intervals across the range. This tested reaction time and quick target acquisition, skills that did, unfortunately, diminish with age. Margaret missed 2 of the 15 targets, her reflexes just a heartbeat too slow. Roger missed 4. They were the top 2 scorers in their group. Not bad for an old lady, Thompson teased as she rejoined her former team between rounds. Better than you could do with both eyes open, Margaret shot back, and they all laughed, falling into the easy banter of people who had shared dangers and triumphs long ago. Anne approached, her eyes wide with amazement. "Mom, that was incredible. I had no idea you could shoot like that." "There's a lot we still don't know about each other," Margaret said softly. "I'm hoping to change that." The final round was designed to test both precision and performance under pressure. Shooters would have 90 seconds to hit targets of decreasing size at increasing distances, with points awarded based on difficulty. As Margaret stepped up to the line, she felt a twinge in her right shoulder, an old injury from a mission gone sideways decades ago. The kind of pain that weather changes brought out, that reminded her body of its age despite her mind's protests. "You've got this, Mom," Anne called from the sidelines. Margaret rolled her shoulder gently, acknowledging the pain without surrendering to it. This was reality. She wasn't the shooter she had been at 30. But she knew something now that she hadn't known then, how to work with limitations rather than fighting against them. Final round. "Shooters ready, begin." Margaret started with the farthest, smallest target, the opposite of what most competitors would do. Get the hardest shot out of the way first while her arms were still fresh. The target was a mere 3 inches across at a distance of 200 yards. Child's play compared to some shots she'd made in the field. The crack of her rifle was followed by the ping of a direct hit. Without pausing to celebrate, she moved to the next target and the next, working her way methodically from hardest to easiest. Her shoulder throbbed as the seconds ticked by, but she had long ago learned to compartmentalize pain, breathe through it, accept it, keep going. When the buzzer sounded to end the round, Margaret lowered her rifle slowly, aware suddenly of the absolute silence that had fallen over the range. She turned to see everyone, competitors, spectators, even her former teammates, staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. "Perfect score," Hector announced, his voice carrying across the stunned range, "and a new range record for completion time." The applause started slowly, then built to a roar. Margaret found herself surrounded. By her former team, by Anne and Tom, by Roger and other competitors offering congratulations and asking questions. "How did you do that last shot?" Roger wanted to know. The wind was gusting at least 15 miles per hour. Before Margaret could answer, a woman approached from the far end of the range, one of the observers she had pegged as agency representatives. Mid-40s, short dark hair, the carefully neutral expression of someone accustomed to not revealing their thoughts. "Ms. Chen," the woman said, extending a hand. "Laura Bennett. Very impressive shooting." "Thank you," Margaret replied, recognizing the name from Harold's briefing. "I wonder if we might have a word about that consulting opportunity Colonel Wilson may have mentioned to you." Margaret glanced at Harold, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Give me a moment?" she asked Bennett, who stepped back with professional courtesy. Margaret turned to Anne first. "I need to speak with these people about a job opportunity." "The consulting thing?" Anne asked. "You're really considering it?" "I am." Margaret searched her daughter's face for disapproval but found only curiosity. It would mean some travel. Training sessions at various facilities. Nothing dangerous but meaningful work. Anne surprised her with a hug. "I think you should do it, Mom. I've never seen you like this before, so alive, so yourself." "I'm still getting used to this version of myself," Margaret admitted. "Or maybe I'm just remembering who I used to be." "Well, I like her," Anne said firmly. "And I think Dad would have too." Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders, one she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The fear that embracing her past would somehow distance her from her daughter, the only family she had left. "Dinner tomorrow?" she asked. "I'll tell you more stories. The ones I can share anyway." "It's a date," Anne agreed. "Tom too?" "Of course." As Anne and Tom moved away, Roger approached again. This time with a young woman Margaret recognized as Lily from her first day at the range. "Ms. Chen," Roger said, "I know you're busy, but I wanted to ask. Some of us are forming a training group. Serious practice, not just showing off. We were hoping," he took a deep breath, "would you consider coaching us? Even just occasionally?" Margaret looked from Roger to Lily, seeing genuine interest in their faces. Behind them stood several other young shooters watching hopefully. "I may be traveling a bit," she said carefully. "But when I'm in town, yes, I think I could do that." The delight on their faces was worth any inconvenience it might cause. "Chen," Thompson called. "They're waiting." Margaret nodded and made her way to where Bennett and 3 colleagues stood with her former team. As they began discussing details of the consulting program, she found herself standing straighter, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had once used in briefing rooms around the world. This wasn't the quiet retirement she had planned. It wasn't the anonymous existence she had built for herself after hanging up her scope. It was something new, a bridge between her past and her future, between the legend others saw and the woman she truly was. Later, as the range emptied and the spring sun began to set, Margaret found herself alone at her lane, taking one final practice shot before packing up. The target was simple, a black dot on white paper 200 yards away. No pressure, no audience, just her and the rifle and decades of experience flowing through her steady hands. She took a breath, found her center and squeezed the trigger. Perfect shot. Dead center, some things never changed. And finally, after all these years, Margaret Chen was at peace with that.